For roughly 200 years, the most profitable business on Earth was not a company. It was a country. A cold, rain-soaked island, smaller than a lot of American states, somehow ended up owning a quarter of the planet and pulling a huge share of the world's trade through its own ports. And it did not do that with some kind of military magic. It did it with paperwork, with a blueprint you could read in an accounting book. Now, this is not a story about kings and battles. It is a story about who paid and who got paid. Tonight, we do something different. We follow the money instead of the flag, and we open the ledger that sits underneath the whole legend. Because once you start reading that ledger, you cannot stop. It takes you from the pages of a single slave ship to the boardroom of a corporation that kept a private army twice the size of the nation's own, to a famine that killed millions of people while the food they grew was loaded onto boats and shipped away. And then it takes you somewhere you were not expecting. To right now. To why this machine is still running today. So before we open that ledger, do just one thing. Subscribe and stay with me all the way to the end, because the final number in this account is one that you are still paying for. So let me put a question to you, the kind that sounds simple until you actually try to answer it. Out of every nation on the map, out of every kingdom and empire with bigger armies, richer soil, and far more people, why did this one small island end up running the world? The first part of the answer is the one nobody chooses. It is geography. Britain is an island, and an island does not lie awake at night worrying about an army marching across its border, because there is no border to march across. France had to pour its money into hundreds of thousands of soldiers just to hold its own frontiers. Britain did not. So it took the money everyone else spent on land armies and poured it into one thing instead: ships. A navy is not just defense for an island. It is reach. It is the ability to touch every coastline on the planet and decide who trades and who does not. But reach on its own is just ambition. What turned ambition into a system was something far less romantic. It was a way of borrowing money. Here is the part most people never learn. In the years around 1688, Britain went through a political revolution that quietly rewired its finances, and a few years later, in 1694, it created the Bank of England. Suddenly, the government could borrow enormous sums, cheaply, and pay it back reliably. And when a lender trusts you, your interest rate falls. For long stretches of the 1700s, Britain could borrow at roughly 3%, while its great rival across the water, France, paid far more for the same money. Think about what that actually means. Two countries want to build a fleet, or fight a war, or fund a trading company. One of them pays 3%. The other pays far more. Run that gap across 100 years, and it is not a small edge. It is the difference between an empire that can keep spending and a rival that slowly bleeds itself dry. Historians like Douglas North and Robert Allen have pointed to exactly this, that cheap, trustworthy credit was one of Britain's deepest advantages, long before a single factory chimney appeared. And then came the third piece. Coal, sitting in the ground in enormous quantities, and a farming revolution that meant fewer hands were needed to grow the nation's food. That freed up people to leave the fields and pour into workshops and, eventually, factories. So look at what this one island had lined up, all at the same time. The cheapest money in Europe, a navy that could reach any shore, and a growing engine of industry with the fuel to run it. No single one of those would have been enough. Together, they were a loaded weapon. But an advantage is only ever potential. A loaded weapon does nothing until someone decides to use it. So the real question is the one we turn to now. How exactly did they take those three advantages and turn them into cold, hard, repeatable money? Now, do something for me. Push the portraits of generals and the grand speeches about civilization out of your mind for a moment and look at the things sitting underneath all of it. The business model. Because once you see it, you cannot unsee it, and the whole empire suddenly stops looking like a story about glory and starts looking like a machine that ran on one simple loop. Here is how the loop worked. A colony hands over raw materials, the cheap stuff, cotton, sugar, tea, timber, dug or grown or picked by people who are paid almost nothing or nothing at all. Those raw materials get shipped home to Britain. In Britain, they are turned into finished goods, cloth, refined sugar, manufactured products worth many times more than what went in. And then, here is the clever, brutal part. those finished goods are sold straight back to the very colonies that produce the raw materials in the first place. Raw materials out at a low price. Finished goods back in at a high one. And Britain takes a cut at every single stage of that journey. Now, a loop like that only works if you control all of it, and this is where it stops being ordinary trade and becomes something engineered. Britain did not just buy and sell. It owned the inputs, it owned the factories, it owned the ships that carried everything, and it owned the markets at both ends. The colony was not allowed to break the loop by building its own factory and selling its own cloth. That was, quite literally, against the law. And I mean that literally. Go back to 1651 and you find the Navigation Acts, a set of laws that said colonial goods had to travel on British ships through British ports on British terms. This was not an accident of history. This was policy, written down, signed, and enforced. Now, before anyone says every empire behaved this way, let us be fair, because they did reach for similar tricks. The Dutch had already built an early version of this with their own East India Company, and the Spanish had squeezed their colonies for silver long before London got serious. So Britain did not invent extraction. What Britain did was scale it and wire it into a financial system so tight that the profits did not just get spent, they got reinvested, lent out, and turned into even more capital. The difference was never that the British were somehow more wicked than everyone else. The difference was that they built a better machine, and they oiled it with money in a way no rival ever matched. So that is the design. Raw materials in, finished goods out, and a set of laws to make sure nobody escaped the circuit. But a machine, no matter how well designed, does not start itself. It needs fuel to turn over for the very first time. It needs seed capital. And the seed capital that got this entire engine running came from the darkest place in the whole story, a place we have to walk into next. Every empire needs starting capital. Britain found part of its own in human beings. I want to be careful here because this is the part of the story where it is tempting to look away, and we are not going to. Somewhere in a London archive, there are ledgers from slave ships. And in those ledgers, human beings are written down the same way you would record barrels of sugar or bolts of cloth. A number in one column. A price in the next. That is where I want you to start, because the machine we have been describing did not see people. It saw entries. Here is how the seed capital was raised. Ships left British ports carrying manufactured goods, guns, cloth, iron. They sailed to the coast of West Africa and traded those goods for human beings. Those men, women, and children were packed into the holds and carried across the Atlantic, a crossing so brutal it has its own name, the Middle Passage. The ones who survived were sold in the Americas to work sugar and cotton plantations until they died. And the ships turned around and carried that sugar and cotton back to Britain. 3 sides of a triangle and profit on every side. And the money did not stop with a few merchants. It did not sit quietly in private pockets. It flowed into banks. It built the insurance market. The great financial houses of the day grew fat underwriting these voyages, insuring the ships and, monstrously, the people chained inside them. This trade was woven directly into the financial fabric of the country. Let me give you the scale, from records we can actually check. According to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, a project that has counted these voyages one by one across every European flag, around 12.5 million Africans were forced onto these ships, and Britain itself carried roughly 3 million of them. Roughly 1.8 million of them never reached the other side. They died in the crossing. Now, in fairness, I have to give you the other half of this, because the honest version is more complicated than the angry one. Britain did eventually abolish this trade, and then went further than almost anyone. Its navy created a squadron whose only job was to hunt down slave ships, even ships flying other nations' flags. In the decades that followed, the Royal Navy stopped around 1,600 vessels and freed something like 150,000 people, at a cost some historians put at almost 2% of the nation's income, year after year. That is real, and it matters. But here is the sentence that has to sit next to it. When Britain abolished slavery in 1833, the compensation did not go to the people who had been enslaved. It went to their owners. 20 million pounds of public money paid out to slaveholders for the loss of their property. and the loan the government took out to cover it was so large that British taxpayers were still paying it off until the year 2015. Almost every adult in modern Britain helped pay the slave owners, without ever being told. Historians still argue about how much of the Industrial Revolution this money paid for. Some say it was the engine. Others say the Industrial Revolution drew on many sources, not just this one, and the truth is more tangled. But even the most cautious estimate lands in the same place. This was one of the largest injections of seed capital in human history, and its fuel was people. That fuel lit the fire. What kept it burning for a century sat on the far side of the world. If this empire had a single crown jewel, it was not a gold mine, and it was not a trading post. It was an entire civilization, a subcontinent of hundreds of millions of people, with its own industries, its own bankers, and its own way of life stretching back thousands of years. And here is what almost nobody is taught. Before the British arrived, India was not some poor, backward land waiting to be developed. It was the workshop of the world. For centuries, the finest cloth on the planet came out of Indian looms. When Europeans wanted the best cotton and silk, they came to India and paid for it, in silver. So the obvious question is, how do you take the richest manufacturing region on Earth and turn it into a captive supplier for a small island thousands of miles away? The answer is one of the strangest facts in all of history. India was not conquered by a country. It was conquered by a company. The East India Company was founded in 1600 as a business, a group of merchants with shareholders and a profit motive. But over time, it did something no company had ever done. It raised its own army. By its peak, in the early 1800s, that private army numbered somewhere around 260,000 men, roughly twice the size of Britain's own national army. Let that sit for a moment. A corporation, answerable to its shareholders, commanded a military force larger than the government's. With that army, it won the Battle of Plassey in 1757, and a few years later, in 1765, it seized something even more valuable than territory. It won the right to collect taxes across a vast and wealthy region. And this is where the trick becomes almost too clever to believe. The company began using the tax money it collected from Indians to buy Indian goods, which it then shipped back to Britain and sold at a profit. India was, in effect, being forced to pay for its own looting. I want to make this human for a second. Picture a weaver, one of the most skilled in the world at the craft. This person pays a tax to the company. That tax money is then used to buy the very cloth they wove, which is carried away to England, where it undercuts and eventually destroys the market they once sold to. Their skill, their taxes, and their finished cloth are all flowing in the same direction, out. This was the machine running on a single human life, multiplied by tens of millions. Now, you will often hear that India made up around a quarter of the world's economy back then, and that is true, but let us be precise about it. That number mostly reflects how many people lived there, not how rich each one was. The honest point is not that every Indian was wealthy. It is that an enormous, productive economy was slowly redirected to serve someone else. So how much wealth actually left? Here the estimates get staggering and controversial. The economist Utsa Patnaik put the figure at around $45 trillion. That number, though, is not raw cash. It is calculated by taking the wealth drained over nearly 2 centuries and compounding it, the way interest grows in a bank account, to show its worth today. Strip out that compounding and the raw sum is far smaller. But even the most conservative version describes one of the largest transfers of wealth from one people to another that the world has ever seen. Owning the wealth and the land was still not enough. The machine needed a way to turn all of it into profit that repeated, year after year. Now, at this point, the defenders of empire step forward with their strongest card, and I think we owe it to them to look at it honestly. Britain, they say, gave India the railways. It built the ports, strung the telegraph wires, and laid tens of thousands of miles of track across the subcontinent. That is true. All of it was really built. So let us take that argument seriously, and then simply follow the tracks and see where they actually lead. Start with the problem the empire was trying to solve. The Industrial Revolution had turned Britain into a machine that produced far more cloth and goods than its own people could ever buy. A factory that makes far more than the home market could ever absorb has only 2 options. slow down, or find someone else to sell to. And the empire had already built the answer into its structure. Captive markets. Hundreds of millions of colonial subjects who could be made to buy British goods, whether they wanted them or not. But there was a catch. India already made its own cloth, and made it better. So, the finest textile industry in the world had to be dismantled to make room. And here, the numbers tell a story that words almost cannot. In the middle of the 1700s, India produced around a quarter of the world's manufactured goods. By the year 1900, that share had collapsed to less than 2%. An entire civilization of craftspeople was pushed out of manufacturing and back into the fields to grow raw materials for someone else's factories. Those figures come from the economic historian Paul Byrock, and they describe one of the largest deindustrializations in recorded history. Now, back to those railways. Look at a map of where the tracks actually ran. They were laid out, first and foremost, to move raw materials to the ports. They ran from the interior, where the cotton and the wheat and the coal were, straight out to the ports, where it could all be loaded onto ships bound for Britain. The railway was not a gift to India. It was the delivery system of the machine. And who paid for it? This is the part that should make you sit up. The railways were built by private British companies that were promised a guaranteed return, around 5%, no matter what. If the railway lost money, Indian taxpayers made up the difference. So the profits flowed to British investors, and the risk sat squarely on Indian shoulders. It was private profit backed by a public guarantee, the perfect deal, if you happen to be a shareholder in London. Historians like Dan Bogart and Latika Chaudhary have traced exactly how that arrangement worked. So was the infrastructure real? Yes. Some of it is still in use today, and honest writers like Niall Ferguson are right to point that out. But real is not the same as generous. A road built to carry away your grain is still a road, and you may even use it later. That does not mean it was built for you. The railways of India were engineering for extraction, dressed up as a gift. A system that pulls value this hard always has a breaking point. And when this one finally broke, the price was not measured in money. It was measured in human lives. Now we come to the part of this story that numbers alone can never carry. I have given you a lot of figures so far, percentages and trillions and dates. But this next part is not about accounting. It is about what happens when a machine built to extract value meets a year when the harvest fails. The pattern goes like this, and once you see it, you will see it again and again. A famine begins. Crops fail, as crops sometimes do. But the food does not stop moving. In the name of free trade and market forces, grain keeps being loaded onto ships and carried away, out of the mouths of starving people, and sold abroad, because the market said it should go where the money was. People did not starve because there was no food. They starved because they could no longer afford the food that was right in front of them. That last idea is not mine. It comes from the economist Amartya Sen, who won the Nobel Prize for showing something devastatingly simple. Most modern famines, he found, are not caused by a lack of food. They are caused by a collapse in what he called entitlement, the ability of ordinary people to buy or claim the food that exists. Hunger, in other words, was not a natural disaster. It was a price. Let me make this real, because it deserves to be. Bengal, 1943. Between 2 and 3 million people died, driven less by grain leaving the country than by wartime inflation and hoarding. And in the city of Calcutta, people starved to death on the pavements outside shops that were still stocked with rice they simply could not afford. Whole families walked in from the countryside searching for food that the market had priced beyond their reach, and they died in the streets of one of the richest trading cities in the empire. And this was not only an Indian story. Go back a century, to Ireland, between 1845 and 1852. Roughly 1 million people died in a famine, while food, grain, and livestock continued to be shipped out of Ireland and across to Britain. The same logic, the same machine, a different set of victims. There was a man who saw all of this clearly, long before the rest of the world caught up. His name was Dadabhai Naoroji, and back in 1901 he wrote a book laying out what he called the drain, the steady, relentless transfer of wealth out of India that left it too poor to withstand a bad harvest. He was not guessing. He was adding it up. And the historian Mike Davis, writing much later, would document how famines like these, across the late 1800s, killed on a scale that is almost impossible to hold in the mind. This is the true cost of the ledger we opened at the very start. Not lines in a book. Not columns of profit. Millions of human beings who died not because the world ran out of food, but because a system decided their lives were worth less than the trade. A system that could do this should have collapsed under the sheer moral weight of it. But empires do not fall because they are cruel. This one did not end because the world finally saw what it was. It ended for a reason far more blunt and far less noble. So we arrive, at last, at the death of the empire. It did not come on a battlefield. It came quietly, in a ledger, when the numbers finally stopped adding up. And here is the twist most stories miss. Britain's decline did not begin with the World Wars. It began earlier, around the year 1900, when other nations simply started out building it. Germany and the United States were overtaking Britain in steel, in chemicals, in the new electrical industries, the technologies that would define the next century. The empire was still vast, still rich on paper, but the industrial engine at its core was already falling behind. The historian Corelli Barnett argued that Britain had been living off its imperial position long before it admitted the factories at home were no longer the best in the world. Then came the two world wars, and they did to the finances what decades of decline had merely threatened. They drained the treasury completely. And here is a fact that turns the whole story upside down. By 1945, Britain did not just owe money in general. It owed India around 1.3 billion pounds in what were called sterling balances. The colony, supposedly the source of all that wealth, had become the creditor. The looter now owed the looted. The final crack came in 1947. Britain was forced to make its currency freely convertible, a condition of a desperately needed American loan, and within about 5 weeks, the whole arrangement collapsed in a financial crisis. The age of the territorial empire was effectively over. But, and this is the sentence I really want you to hold on to, the empire of territory died. The empire of money did not. The colonies became independent, one after another. Yet the architecture the empire had built stayed exactly where it was. The city of London remained a global financial center. A web of offshore havens, places like the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and the British Virgin Islands, many of them still tied to Britain, became the plumbing of the modern financial world. English contract law, the English language of trade, all of it stayed. The writer Nicholas Shaxson has traced how that offshore network grew directly out of the old imperial system. The story after independence, though, was not the same everywhere. A few former colonies, Singapore and Hong Kong among them, used that inherited position to become wealthy hubs. Many others were left stuck exporting raw materials, exactly as the old machine had designed them to. The starting line was never level. That is the honest verdict, without pretending everyone ended up in the same place. So when the flag finally came down and the empire seemed to end, the machine did not switch off. It simply changed its name. So let me bring you back to the promise I made at the very start, the final number in this account that you are still paying for today. Here it is. Britain handed back its colonies, but it never dismantled the system it built. The map on your wall changed color. The machinery underneath it never did. Every trade route, every shipping lane, every quiet offshore account is a line in a ledger that was opened centuries ago and has never once been closed. You did not inherit a world that simply happened. You inherited the settlement of an account that someone else drew up. If you followed the money all the way to the end, do one small thing for me. Type a single word in the comments. Ledger. That is all, just so I know you made it here with me. And if this changed the way you see that map, the like and the subscribe are honestly the only reason stories told this slowly, this carefully, can keep getting made. That is the whole deal, and it costs you nothing. Now, before you go, sit with one last thought. Britain built its power on ships, on factories, on debt. Extraction was its whole language. And yet, centuries before any of it, a very different empire, one with no navy, no factories, and not a single bank, moved more people, more goods, and more ideas across the world than London ever would. History called them barbarians. but they may have understood the economics of connection better than the empire that called itself civilized. How does a people on horseback build one of the largest trade networks the world had ever seen? That is the missing piece of everything you just heard. And it is already waiting for you, right there on your screen.